Je pense sans cesse à toi.
Well, hello, and welcome to The Foretop, a roundtable discussion of today's hot-button topics in food and beverage. I'm your host, Catherine Cole. On today's show, we will nosh on 3 courses. First, recipe theft. Next, born-again chefs. And for our 3rd course, tipping over. As in, is tipping over? Or is the end of tipping over? We're so confused. Our esteemed panelists here in the studios of Oregon Public Broadcasting are Ivy Manning, author of 5 cookbooks and contributor to national magazines such as Cooking Light and Fine Cooking. Hey, Ivy.
Hello.
And Laura Russell, cookbook author, food writer, and recipe developer. Hi, Laura.
Hey there.
And Jeff Alworth, blogger and author of The Beer Bible and Cider Made Simple, and co-host of the Beervana podcast. Welcome, Jeff.
Hi, Catherine.
Okay, let's bite into our first course, recipe theft. Ivy Manning, I hear a lot of frustration from food folks in the food industry that their innovative recipes are being copied and reused for profit. Has this affected you in your work as a recipe developer and cookbook author?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I have Google alerts, and I get alerts that my entire books are, free download. They're through BitTorrent sites, so...
What?
Yeah. They're through BitTorrent sites, though, and a lot of them are actually just a conduit for viruses. So sort of, stealer beware. I talked to my publishers about it, and their attitude largely, and a lot of these sites, because you can look at their IP address and realize that they're not real, is that it's sort of a whack-a-mole. You can ask them to take it down, and it'll just pop up on another site instantly. And those are downloadable, so it's not you really can't keep up with it. But as far as like recipes appearing elsewhere with one slight change and you recognize it as yours, yeah, that does happen. So there's both things. Both are a problem. But
now I've learned since we decided to talk about this that according to the U.S. Copyright Office, you actually cannot copyright a list of ingredients. So you can't copyright the sort of the core ingredient list of the recipe, but you can copyright sort of the instructions. Is that correct?
That's right, Catherine. So legally they look at it more like an equation. So the list of ingredients cannot be copyrighted. However, the head note and the way that I express how to, for instance, put together a tamale, that wording can be copyright. So it's really tenuous kind of how – and are you going to go after someone who, took something off a blog versus took it right out of one of your cookbooks? Because a cookbook itself is copyright. So you can ask people to take things down or properly accredit you. But I'm sure Laura can add to this because she is also an esteemed cookbook author.
I've definitely had similar issues. A lot of times I think you'll see – I'll see my recipes or things that look very, very similar to my recipes pop up on someone's blog. But one in particular, about 5 years ago, I wrote a book called The Gluten-Free Asian Kitchen. And at the time – I researched gluten-free pot stickers. And, this wasn't a traditional type of dumpling, with tapioca or with rice flour, but something that actually had to be sort of reinvented. And at the time, there weren't any. And again, thank goodness for Google Alerts, right? I found, gluten-free pot stickers. And someone had, reproduced my recipe absolutely word for word. And they even they took their own photograph, but they styled it exactly the same way it was in my book. And they had it on a how-to video website. So when it's so blatant, it's hard. That's when you get into cease and desist letters. But a lot of recipes, you really can't do much because, as Ivy said, you can't copyright the ingredient list. So, if someone just has a salad and they change, parsley to cilantro and call it their own, it's not very ethical, but it unfortunately happens all the time.
Jeff, do you know of this happening in the beverage world?
Well, yeah, it's interesting you say that because beer is actually quite a bit like food. It's a thing that you put together with ingredients and you apply heat and you create this compound that has all the different flavors that come through that alchemy. So in a way, it's very much composed of ingredients in the same way, and you have a recipe. So it is an issue with brewers. Breweries, when they develop a beer that tastes distinctive and it becomes popular, they want to have that be their, the face of the brewery. They want people to associate those flavors with their brewery. So they don't like other breweries making their beer, and yet it's pretty easy to replicate flavors. And I think this is probably true with recipes, whether you copy it exactly or not, but there are ways to recreate a thing even without knowing what the recipe is. So other brewers are pretty clever, and they can figure out ways to break it down and reconstruct it themselves in their own brew houses.
Definitely the reverse engineering thing.
Yeah.
If you know how to cook and you have a good palate, you realistically could recreate someone else's recipe.
Right.
Do you guys all remember the cronut and the cruffin?
Yes.
I loved those two. I mean, first of all, crossing a croissant and a donut or a muffin just seems totally absurd to me. But the guy who originated the cronut, I believe he was a French pastry chef in New York, trademarked the name after he was outraged that people were making copycat cronuts. And then the guy in San Francisco who came up with the cruffin recipe, someone actually physically broke into their bakery and stole nothing but the recipes. They didn't even steal the recipe books. They tore them out of the recipe books. So I didn't realize how precious these recipes are, but I can tell that Laura and Ivy, these are your livelihood that people are stealing.
Right. That does stick in my craw a bit. And with the advent of blogging, it's a problem. I mean, I've had Google alerts let me know that someone has taken 3 or 4 of my recipes right out of my book. And even mentioned the title of my book, but didn't link to me or, give me any, backtrack to my blog or anything like that. So, I mean, that was time for a cease and desist. And she was surprised. She claimed to be surprised, genuinely surprised, that she couldn't just tear out pages from a book and put them on a website. And I was not the only one. I mean, I think the more popular you are, the more likely it is you're going to be able to stop this from happening. For instance, there's a very well-read blog called Simply Recipes, Elise Bauer started, and she found an ebook on Amazon that was all recipes from her website. And instead of going the long route of hiring very expensive lawyers and going after them, she went straight to Amazon and to social media, and all the people that loved her blog, her website, gave the ebook terrible, terrible reviews and sort of ended the whole thing before Amazon eventually took it down. But there was never any financial recompense. She never got money for the money that was made on her recipes under someone else's name. And that's where it starts, that's where rubber hits the road and it starts to hurt, is financially. If they're making money off of your work, that's a problem.
I think this is where social media can really come in handy. If someone creates an identifiable recipe, people know about it. People share food photos on Instagram. And for instance, I was reading recently about a bakery that was serving cereal milk ice cream. Well, today, anybody who claims to serve cereal milk ice cream without directly or indirectly crediting Momofuku Milk Bar kind of just looks like a jackass, because everybody knows where it came from. You see photos and you hear the talk online. And I think that's part of it too. If just, give people credit, link to the author where you found the original recipe. And often that's enough. You might not be able to get money from someone, but at least traffic people to your own website.
Well, let me play devil's advocate for a moment. I mean, someone must have come up with spaghetti and meatballs centuries ago, or the Earl of Sandwich maybe, or maybe not, came up with the sandwich recipe. And, these are public. Anyone can make these recipes now. And shouldn't these be in the public domain? Shouldn't recipes be shared with everyone?
So I have a beer analog here, but also emerging from this conversation, an idea that comes to me, which is that I think you can trademark or copyright, depending on what the concept is, an idea or a brand. And in beer, actually, there's a beer style steam beer, which is trademarked by the Anchor Beer Company, and nobody can make a beer called steam beer. They can make a beer that tastes exactly like that, and they have to call it something else, but they can't call it steam beer. So you can trademark like the category, but not necessarily the recipe. It seems like a slight distinction, and it seems that that's the case in food as well, maybe?
I feel a little bit like, as a recipe writer, as a little bit of a second-class citizen in that, if you look at the copyright law on music and art, it's much stricter. But, for us Becky Homekis out there, writing down how to make, a beautiful dish, well, that's not art. That's not creative. It's just it's chemistry. So you can't really copyright that. That kind of miffs me a little bit. But the words that we write in our head notes and the experiences we give people in a curated cookbook, I still believe in. So I'm going to keep doing it.
Yeah, and I understand what you're saying, Catherine. At a certain point, what can you do with tomatoes and basil, that hasn't been done before? How can I make up something and say this is my recipe? It had to have been done somewhere along the way. But I'm with Ivy. I'm going to keep writing for magazines and keep writing cookbooks, and hopefully people like my style.
Let's peel back the curtain for a minute and reveal to our listeners that we're actually sipping something as we chat about recipes. I'm going to hand this to Laura and ask her what she sees on the label.
It is a lovely pale rosé called Terra Corsa Vin de Corse 2015.
And do you know what Vin de Corse means?
Of course not.
It just means it's from Corsica. And I was super excited to see this in my local grocery store because until now it was really hard to find rosés from Corsica other than in specialty wine shops. And here this was in the grocery store. It's a Corsican rosé. The grape is Nealuccio, also called Nealuccio, which is a very close relation of Sangiovese. And it's made by the big cooperative on Corsica, so it's very affordable. And I just wanted to share it with you all while the weather's still nice. I will continue to pour rosé until snow starts falling. What do you all think of it?
I love it. I'm thinking fried chicken picnic. And this one.
What do you think, Jeff?
Oh, boy. I'm a beer guy. It's always a challenge when I have to go cross beverage. But it's very nice. It's very crisp. It does seem summery. It seems like something I'd like to have on the back deck on a hot day.
Now for our second course, Born Again Chefs. After decades of culinary decadence, many well-known chefs are doing some serious soul-searching. Most famously, New York celebrity chef David Bouley is shuttering his namesake restaurant and going on sabbatical with the plan to reopen a smaller place focusing on the healing power of food. Laura Russell, you had your own sort of culinary rebirth some years back when you discovered you were gluten intolerant, so I bet you have a really interesting perspective on this. What's going on here?
Well, indeed, I have had my own culinary rebirth, for sure. If you would have talked to me a decade ago, I had a very, very cavalier attitude toward healthy cooking. I never would have understood why anyone would eliminate any kind of foods from their diets. And then I started getting sick. So I figure maybe that was karma at work there, trying to get me to change my attitude. But after being, increasingly sick for 4 or 5 years, what solved my health issues in the end was a major overhaul of my diet. And that's been about 8 or 9 years, and my dietary changes have really, led to my health. I'm interested in seeing these things happen with so many chefs now, whether they're, turning vegan or vegetarian, or like you said, David Bouley is traveling around the world, learning about the connections between food and health. Seamus Mullen is a New York chef at Tertulia who has discovered how anti-inflammatory foods have healed his rheumatoid arthritis. But what that means for the rest of us, I hope, is that we're starting to see changes on restaurant plates. Chefs are willing to make things that aren't immediately going to make us want to take a nap. There's more and more options than just that heavy, thick, either meat and potatoes or heavy gluten, whatever it is. But I'd be interested, Ivy, your husband's a vegetarian and you're not a vegetarian. I'm just curious if it's becoming easier and easier for you guys to dine out. Are you finding that it's there's more options for everybody?
Oh, yeah. It's as sort of a feeder. I'm always looking out for what other people are going to eat. So the second, even before we go to a restaurant, I'll go online and look at the menu to make sure that my husband has stuff to eat, because otherwise he gets crabby. He has to have a side salad or whatever, and it's sort of, in a way, it's disrespectful to have an all meat menu that's heavy and no substitutions and no thought to the fact that there are people that have different lifestyle choices than you do. So I think it's great that there is some diversity. I do think there's a certain amount of bandwagonism that, there are popular places that are turning to vegan, and I think it's more of a financial decision for them that they can tout themselves as vegan, and that's kind of hot right now, so that they, might be just jumping on the bandwagon a little bit. So I'm always skeptical when there's a huge change like that, like a polar opposite change. So some party guy that owns 24 bars in New York City suddenly makes all of his restaurants vegan. It's like, wonder what marketing guru told you that was a great idea.
Could you be referring to Ravi Durasi, who owns Death and Company and many other bars and restaurants in New York?
He says he's going to transition all of his places into vegan in the next few years. And we'll see how that works out, because I don't know about you, but when I'm drunk, I want a corn dog. So we'll see.
So does everybody.
Well, and Jose Andres has opened a fast casual veggie chain called Beefsteak all around the D.C. area, too. Are vegan, do you think that's a cheaper food? It must be a cheaper food to produce. Is that part of the financials?
It can be, but you also have to consider that vegetarian and vegan food is a little bit more involved in preparing, because you can't really do a the 3-point landing on the plate, a big hunk of meat and then a little side dish and a little side dish. You have to think about meals it's a little bit more labor intensive to put together really brilliant vegan and vegetarian options. You have to think a little bit more about flavor and texture, I believe. Whereas if you serve just a big hunk of steak and a baked potato, it's pretty easy. I mean, you're just getting by on how great that steak is. So you've got to think about things a little bit more. So it might not necessarily be a financial thing. I'm not sure.
Jeff, what do you think?
Well, I do think that there's trends here, dining trends, everything. There's a trend in everything. And when you go to very heavily meaty, and here in Portland, we've had a spate of really meaty restaurants, even called things like Beast and Ox, like really hearty, a lot of meat stuff. It'll swing back to whatever's the opposite of that, which I guess would be vegan. But I also wonder if there's not an issue here about the growing awareness of kind of as we become more familiar with where our food comes from, and this is definitely a thing that's happening on the West Coast, we become more sensitive to the ecosystem. And I know that global warming is a big factor among anybody who grows anything, any kind of farmer, orchardist, vintner. They all are aware of how the world is changing. And these really indulgent, especially meat-based diets, I think are kind of, they feel very indulgent when you put them up against that. We know how many calories it takes to raise cattle and all these other things. So I think there's maybe a sensitivity that we need to back off this kind of really indulgent eating.
I agree with you that a lot of these changes are either based on health or sustainability. That's a huge factor in both meat and dairy-based diets, just the resources they use. So I really appreciate just any type of restaurant getting more vegetables or more plant-based foods on the plate, not only just as a great option for those of us who want to choose those things when we're eating out, but I think when you taste a vegetable that's been really well prepared at a restaurant, the chef is really taking a role in education. For me, a great example here in Portland, Troy McClarty at Bollywood Theater, for instance. I always have hated okra, but he finally has created the okra dish that's so amazing that now I realize I can like okra, so I'm willing to cook it at home. Same thing with Joshua McFadden at Ava Jeans. He adds so much brightness and so much acidity to normal vegetables. I think it shows us all that it doesn't have to be as boring as steamed broccoli, and maybe it will move everyone in the direction of a little less meat on their plate.
This all sounds so high-minded and noble, and the side of me who eats this way totally appreciates what you guys are saying, but I have to come back to this New York bar owner who said he became vegan after his cat died. I mean, do you think he really – I don't know. I don't know this guy. Maybe he is completely earnest, but it strikes me – I want to get back to what Ivy was saying, because it strikes me – they say new independent restaurants – like 90% of them close within the first 5 years. Maybe these people are just trying to reinvent themselves. Or is there a thought that, eating out is an indulgence? Maybe you only go to that meat restaurant once a month, but do you go back to the vegan restaurant twice a week because it doesn't feel like an indulgence? Is there a crass side to this?
We all stroke our chins.
Anybody that wears a Fitbit and is vaguely obsessed with how many steps they're getting a day, like I am, I think a lot of us are getting more healthy and are more aware. And I think the more physical activity you're getting, actually, the more you crave good things. But I do kind of wonder, just being on Instagram, and if you post a picture, mark my words, if you post a picture of fried chicken and waffles, you'll get like a bazillion likes. But if you post a little salad, not so much, not often. People still crave indulgent, big, rich things. And in a lot of, I think sometimes the perception is, well, I can't do that at home, so I'm going to order it out. For instance, I would never make fish and chips at home. But as soon as we go out, that's, what I'm going to get, because a chef can do it better than I can, and it's not going to stink up my kitchen.
Good point, Ivy.
I know when we lived in New York City, you eat out pretty much every night. Almost every night. Either you eat in a restaurant or carry out. So I think for people who are dining more frequently, just having healthier options in general is a must. There's no way you can keep up, a normal weight and, not be sluggish all the time if you're going out to eat, 7 to 14 meals a week and it's just heavy, heavy, heavy. I think people in the bigger cities especially are going to like having those kind of regular options.
Well, now I think it's time for our third course. New York City restaurateur Danny Meyer famously banned tipping from all of his restaurants in 2015. Since then, many other dining establishments across the country have followed suit, but in the past few months, many have reverted back to the tipping model. Jeff Alworth, you're someone who travels to Europe a lot, and I know you and I have had an interesting conversation about the European attitude toward tipping as opposed to the American one. So I would love for you to kind of work this through in your mind and let us know what do you think about this whole tossing tipping away trend, and then the fact that it's not working in the U.S.
Yeah, it's interesting. And when we were looking through some of the articles about this, getting ready, I was on the internet and I was seeing the guides for Europeans traveling to the United States, and all this information about tipping, and it was treating us like we're this very exotic foreign country that has these extremely bizarre Baroque practices. So I think the rest of the world is probably we may be out of step with the rest of the world on this one. It's definitely true that when I'm in a pub in Britain, I don't have to worry so much about how many drinks I'm having. Usually just throw a little something on at the end for the wait staff and you're done. In the United States, we have this long tradition of tipping. So shifting away from the tip, as some restaurants have tried to do, you run up against a big cultural model that's the expectation of the diner is that you're going to tip. So if you take that away, you have to encourage your diners to come along with you. And we have seen among some of the restaurants that have tried it, it's worked, and some it hasn't worked. It seems like how you set it up and how transparent you are in talking with your customers helps that cultural shift take place. And I think it's fairly recent phenomenon, so we're going to have to watch it and see what develops. But I'm interested to hear what you all think.
Laura, what do you think about this?
Well, I would love to see the end of tipping. How easily that's going to come about, I'm not sure. I'm a big fan of cooks, and I think in the current system, front of the house, servers are paid so much more than cooks. I just think there's an enormous fairness issue there. I think that customers can be uncomfortable with it. I'm not that old, but I remember when, you tipped 10%, and then it was 12, and then it was 15, and then it was 18, and now it's 20. And that entire time, the underlying prices were increasing as well. So it's very random, and just it's such a wild card, leaving salaries up to the whim of the customer. So anyway, as you can tell, I'm not a big fan of tipping in general. Of course, telling servers that they're going to go from making $40 or $45 an hour to making $15 an hour is going to be a really tough sell. And I think, I do think that's going to be a huge challenge for restaurants.
Ivy, you've worked in kitchens. What's your perspective?
Well, I remember cooks would get off work and we would go across the street to, a dive bar and barely be able to afford domestic beer. While our cohorts the servers that work the front of the house were walking away with $400, $450 in cash, would go drink Fernet Branca down the street. So there was a feeling of animosity and not so much of a team sort of thing, which did kind of dig into how well the kitchen worked. Because if a server, with a hoity-toity server forgot to order a salad or sauce on the side or something, we'd be like, yeah, I'll get right on that. Because you kind of had this attitude that, like, we're doing all the work. You're just bringing the food out. And I know that's not the actual reality of a server's job. It's a very difficult job. I was just in a restaurant here in Portland that went tip-free about, I think it had only been 3 weeks. And in the process, he had lost all of his servers. They all left because they wanted part-time jobs that they could make a lot of money at quickly. And they didn't want to work full-time. And he was going to a model where it was much more full-time and everybody did everything. So what he ended up having to do is train his kitchen staff how to wait tables. So everybody's doing every job and you're learning a real trade. You're learning the entire restaurant trade. When you come out of the pastry chef kitchen, for instance, and you're also learning how to make cocktails and you're learning how to interact with the public and serving, which is a different skill. So for the servers, it wasn't such a good deal, but for the cooks, he's drawing some incredible talent because they're like, oh, I want to get on board of this. Not only am I getting benefits, I'm getting paid better, and I'm learning all these new skills. So that's a pretty neat model, but it's very difficult to keep it up unless a lot of, like Danny Meyer owns over 12 restaurants. And to have his name on your resume is huge. So people are willing to take a pay cut because his name is so big and his restaurants are such a big deal. So I think it's easier for him to dictate that this is what we all ought to be doing. But in reality, it's very difficult.
So it sounds like we need to sort of advance to the place where people see restaurant work as a real career and they will devote themselves entirely to restaurant work. Well, what you were saying about this chef's staff quitting, it makes perfect sense. If you own a restaurant and you say, oh, I'm going to start offering benefits to everyone, well, that young, attractive wait person who never goes to the doctor is going to say, I don't need benefits. When I was a, cocktail waitress, I was making ridiculous amounts of money and I can go somewhere else and do that. And so the only people you have left working for you are people who need health insurance, who maybe aren't, hot young cocktail waitresses. I mean, that's just kind of the way it works. But I like this idea of sort of fostering these people who just love working in all aspects of the restaurant and are just in it for life. That's great.
No, he said he felt like he was sort of everything. The paradigm had shifted, and what he was doing was creating restaurateurs, which is a pretty amazing idea.
And part of it is if you have a hybrid system where some restaurants have tips and some restaurants don't have tips, that creates this kind of imbalance. So if all the restaurants went to this model you're talking about, then it would create a different expectation. So it's a cultural shift in the restaurant itself too. So you don't have this expectation of making a lot of money as a waiter, waitress. But it would also create this expectation among the customers as well. But if you have this halfway system where some restaurants are doing it and some aren't, it might make it much more tenuous for the restaurants that are trying it to get good staff.
I think another issue that's going to pop up over the next few years is a lot of states are implementing this mandatory $15 an hour minimum wage. And that's going to become a huge issue, especially to smaller restaurants, when their labor costs are going up by probably at least 50%. So I think restaurants toying around with these different ideas, like bringing cooks out as wait staff. I think another interesting thing that's been happening here in Portland are a lot of more casual but still delicious restaurants are having customers order at the counter and sit down. And the food is delivered, but essentially there's really no wait staff at all. So they're eliminating that problem right there. I think it's going to take some really creative solutions, though, to get by this, especially in the face of these increasing labor costs.
Well, Laura Russell, you travel a ton and you eat out in the United States a lot as well as in other countries. And I know people always kind of joke about American servers, how the wait people in American restaurants are so chipper and cheery and friendly. And do you think that's because our wait staff are tipped so well?
We travel quite a bit throughout Asia, and it's very different there. When we're there, we eat at a lot of very, very casual places. You would almost call them holes in the wall, but realistically, it's some of the best food I've ever eaten. And they're very busy. It's fast-paced, but it's very, very efficient. They're getting the job done. But you also, in that type of restaurant, aren't expecting, touchy-feely service. But then I've been to restaurants in Tokyo with the most gracious, exquisite service I've ever had anywhere. And there is not only no expectation of gratuity, but it's almost offensive to try to leave a gratuity because that's the way they do it. And they expect that they're there to give you an exceptional evening. It's such a discrepancy between some of the places I've been in Asia and here. But I do think some of the smiles you get in the U.S. are because they know you're not going to tip them if they're surly and grumpy.
Yeah. Why are aspiring actors and actresses wait staff, wait people, because they get great tips, because it's been proven that if you touch someone's shoulder or smile or stoop down to their level, you will definitely get a higher tip. How about you, Jeff? Give us the perspective from Europe. How does the service differ in places where there are no tips?
Well, I don't do a lot of high dining in Europe. I'm more of a downscale guy there, but I have to say I have never been aware of a different kind of quality in the service. It feels very much like it does in the United States. The one exception is I know that I have left tips before, and I've gotten scowls, and I even had a couple of conversations with people where they expressed the idea that that creates a power differential. If you're tipping someone, it becomes like a service relationship, and they don't see themselves. Waiters that I've spoken to in Europe do not feel like they are servers or servile. They don't have that same relationship. And if you're tipping someone, it kind of creates that imbalance.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. I don't think Americans think that way because it's become it's so ingrained in our culture, and we are more egalitarian, I think, kind of class blind in some ways. But it is. I think that is one of those differences that you see in Europe. And so for Americans who are traveling in Europe, if you think it's great, everybody will love extra money. Keep in mind that it can sometimes be considered a little offensive.
Oh, I'm embarrassed now. I think I did say the word server in this segment. I apologize to all the European waiters and waitresses.
Well, and I have not, eaten at all of the restaurants in Europe, so buyer beware.
Well, before we leave our figurative tip and head out, I think we should go around and each share a little something for dessert. I'm going to go first and tell you guys a little story. I promise I'll make it short. I recently took my kids up to visit their grandparents on Whidbey Island, which is a very rural place, and our travel plans got goofed up. We got there late. I was tucking my kids into bed really late, and my daughter looked up at the ceiling, or rather at the rafters, and said, "Mama, what's that?" And I looked up, and there was a bat hanging from the rafters of their bedroom. And I spent about 25 minutes hyperventilating. And then I looked around and realized between the grandparents and the little kids, there was only one person in the room who was going to get that bat down, and it had to be me. So good news, I got the bat out. But then that got me thinking, you know, there are two things in the world that I'm terrified of or disgusted by: bats and cockroaches. And I'm going somewhere with this, and that is, I don't know if you all saw this news item within the last, couple months. There's been this scientific discovery that the world's most nutritious milk is cockroach milk. There is one cockroach, I believe it's the Pacific beetle cockroach, that, unlike other insects, kind of like gives birth and nurses its babies kind of like a mammal.
What?
And has this incredibly nutritious milk that's even more nutritious than buffalo milk. And when our agriculture system collapses, we will all be drinking cockroach milk. And I just don't even know what to think of that because it completely freaks me out. So who's next? Jeff, do you have something more pleasant to talk about?
That's a great lead-in. Yeah, I have an interesting thing that I discovered recently at the Oregon Brewers Festival. We have this big festival here in town, and recently the fest has been inviting foreign breweries to come. And there were some Japanese breweries in town, and we got to learn a little bit about them. And they are making – it turns out that a lot of the craft breweries that are starting in Japan, so most countries have a craft brewing scene, the ones in Japan are very often from old sake breweries, so decades, sometimes centuries old sake breweries. And they're making beer that has qualities of sake. It's made with rice, sometimes sake yeast. And they're using – right now they're kind of in a transitional period where they're making normal styles, but they're transitioning into kind of something that looks like indigenous Japanese beer. And it's drier, it's crisper. Many of them are starting to use more botanicals and other ingredients in it. So it's starting to have kind of an exotic flavor for us regular beer people. And I'm very excited to see what happens the next decade or two in Japan. I think these beers are going to be something entirely new on the face of the earth, and we're all going to be drinking Japanese beers and loving them.
Oh, that sounds delicious and much better than cockroach milk.
Yes, much better than cockroach milk.
Much better.
Laura Russell, what do you have for us?
As I was talking about eating in different Asian countries earlier, one of the things I love is how specialized the food can be and how often restaurants will really, they have one dish they make, and that's why it's so such incredible food, because they do one thing and do it very well. So I was excited to read recently about the Michelin Guide recently launched in Singapore for the first time. And they awarded one Michelin star to his name is Chef Chan Hong Meng of Hong Kong Soya Sauce Chicken Rice and Noodle, which is a hawker stall.
Oh, that's great.
So this is the first street food stand in the world to ever receive a Michelin star. Nice. And the average price of a meal there is about $1.50. And I'm all for that, it being just about the food and how delicious the food is. But I saw an interview with this chef, and he was just the most darling. He's a Malaysian-born chef, and he said that he hopes every chef will put in his best effort as if the inspector is tasting your food at every moment. Only then will your food display your passion. Anyway, I just love the story of him making one dish day after day after day and it winning a Michelin star.
That is heartwarming. I love that. Ivy Manning, what do you have for us?
My dessert today is Aaron Rodgers. He's I hope my husband didn't hear that. He's a quarterback for the Green Bay Packers, which is in the fine state of Wisconsin, my home state. And that also happens to be the dairy state. And preseason, he announced that he is going dairy-free. He has a lingering knee injury, And he finds that when he cuts dairy out of his diet before games, he has less swollen knee. So needless to say, the Wisconsin Dairy Board and a lot of cheeseheads were quite up in arms about this. But nobody else could say that and get away with it but Aaron Rodgers, because that guy can walk on water as far as everybody from Green Bay is concerned. So
maybe he could start drinking cockroach milk.
That's right.
That's it for today. Once again, I want to thank my wonderful panelists. We have over here 2 cookbook authors and recipe developers, Ivy Manning and Laura Russell, and our resident beer and cider expert, Jeff Alworth. Thank you guys so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Hey folks, please pull up a chair to our table and savor the conversation. You can subscribe to The Foretop on iTunes or however you get your podcasts. At facebook.com/theforetop, you can join the conversation and suggest topics for us to discuss. After you like our page, of course. And please tweet us at @4top, all one word. Today's show was recorded at Oregon Public Broadcasting in the high-fiber, protein-packed city of Portland, Oregon. Our show editor and co-producer is Alex Ward. Special thanks to OPB's sound supervisor, Stephen Cray. And our theme music was performed by the incomparable wine importer, Kermit Lynch. I hope you can join us for our next episode, and please tell your friends about The Foretop and give us some loving feedback in iTunes. Ciao!
Nuit blanche, nuit blanche, nuit blanche.
Did anyone leave a tip?